Hi, I'm Michael Huggins and wanted to welcome you to our live webinar on realising value from technology in mining. It's an area we've been doing a lot of work and we're very excited about, and wanted to share some of the things that we've been doing from our experts. But firstly, as we're in the mining sector, we want to do a safety share. One of the things I'm finding personally is before lockdown, we became very vigilant in our precautions around COVID, much better at having safe distances and also washing our hands properly and personal hygiene. And I don't know about others, but I have found since being in the security of my home a lot more and not venturing out, that I've not been as diligent on those fronts. And some of the states in Australia, at least, are now venturing out more. And the reminder is on this safety share to very much try and keep that distance and to keep your personal hygiene and to monitor your own health and safety. It's something I found that I just slipped as I stayed at home, and the risks were obviously less in a situation like that. So it's just a reminder, just to jog your memory as we start to venture out of lockdown, to be precautious. Yeah. Just want to introduce who's on the call on the webinar today. We've got Keith Russell, who heads up our North American practice and has 30 years of experience advising top mining companies throughout North America and the rest of the world, and he will be speaking shortly. Myself, 20 years of experience working predominantly with Australian mining companies. And then the presenters, we have Gerd, who heads up our global digital team, and we'll be talking about establishing big data analytical capability and some of the insights and results that we've had in doing that. We'll then have Ridley, who's a partner in Australia and brings extensive experience in cloud analytics capability, and is going to be talking about some of our experience in that. He's a former CTO and Chief Technology Strategist. And then finally, we'll have Ryan Holbein, who's a partner in our North American practice, talking about how to realise value from technology. He's our global digital lead in the mining practice and based in North America. So that's our team. We've got 3 presenters today. I want to give a little introduction on the topics which we've talked about. We'll also have, I'll just give a little bit on partners and performance so you understand where we're coming from. Keith will talk about some of the trends at a high level on mining in technology, and then we'll have Phil talking about establishing big data capability, Phil on cloud strategy, and Ryan talking about technology, realising value from technology initiatives. So for those who are not aware, the 30 seconds on partners and performance, we've been around for over 20 years and have done over 1,500 engagements in the last 5 years in the resource sector around the world. And we now have a core team of 500 staff, a number that's been growing at roughly 20% per annum. And our focus is very much bottom line results. And I think one of the true uniqueness of partners in performance is that we are global and we are in all the mining regions, and we get our partners together every 6 months to talk about trends and developments in the sector and how best we can help our clients take that forward. So today is an example of that. There's some interesting work happening from different regions around the world, and we wanted to share that with you. So next, I'll hand over to Keith. Thank you.
Thank you. So technology obviously is a major issue in terms of all of our mining companies and clients as we see them around the globe. And I think one of the things that COVID has really done is it's made digital and technology an even more important part of what we're doing and what they're doing and how they're doing it. People are realizing that obviously there's an enormous amount that they can do because of the fact that their digital capability allows them to see what's going on in the mine, in the mill, in the smelter, the refinery, without necessarily having to be there. And so they're also learning to really use data much more to drive their business, rather than relying on the smell and the intuition and the experience of the supervisors that obviously have grown up over time. So where do we see mining companies really putting a lot of effort? I think the first thing that we see is a real drive in terms of building capacity and capability in digital. We see companies seeking out and having digital centers of excellence. We see some of our clients entering into partnerships, long-term partnerships, with various suppliers, whether they're strategic suppliers, whether they're actually technology companies, whether they're hardware companies, software companies, developers from an agile perspective, but really forming partnerships and an ecosystem. And interestingly, with the word ecosystem, I think that this is one of the areas where I also see mining companies reaching across boundaries and sharing with their other mining companies in the same geographic areas in order to be able to say, well, what are some of the lessons learned and how can I end up accelerating what I'm doing? So I certainly see a lot in terms of capability and capacity that people are investing behind it. And interestingly, as we've gone into COVID, I would say this has been one of the areas where people have just kept on making their investment because they see the importance of it, rather than being an area which they have said, oh, this is discretionary, let me hold on. I think the next area that we really see them working on is agile adoption. And it's interesting actually watching mining companies adopt agile, because I think mining companies are often renowned for their more linear, risk-averse approach to technology. It's very much a trial, a pilot, but very much a methodical way forward, rather than this idea of doing something which is agile and going forward with a solution that may not be 100% perfect, but knowing that getting it out there, having speed, working with the line, actually learning is more important than the best process to be able to do it. So I think that's quite a change for many mining companies in terms of what's happening. And then I certainly see a lot of work on terms of the decision support and automation. Much more reliance on data, much more reliance on being able to take the data lake of information which they're generating. I mean, obviously, trucks are generating so much information every second. All of the mill components are also generating information. Taking that information and saying, okay, how can I apply it in a manner that's going to end up cutting costs? And I think when I look across all three of those and I say, well, what are the themes? I think that I'm seeing probably more so today a theme of cost reduction as people are applying this. But I think people are also looking to it from a point of view of growth and safety. Obviously, if I can take people out of some of the dangerous locations in the mine, then automation is really helping. But there's a real top line growth aspect, we can increase productivity. So certainly seeing technology and the technology drivers as being a really major part in terms of what mining companies are doing, and doing on a global basis. So that, let me hand over to Gerd.
Thanks, Keith. And I hope the connection is good for everyone. This section here is the first of three, call it case studies or engagement shares. And the engagement I'm going to be sharing is an enterprise level establishment of a data and analytics capability. If we go to the first slide, I give a bit of a background to the client. So we're talking about a very large Australian listed company. It includes some mining and heavy industry assets, but for the sake of this story, we should think about their retail assets. So they have a number of Australia's largest retailers in their portfolio, a very large data footprint, as you can imagine, all the SKU and point of sale data, the consumer data, the payments data. But the business units are running very, very independently. The company is one of the largest, 50 billion market cap, I think over 20 billion revenue, and traditionally very independently run. When we started there, we started looking at the opportunity of leveraging data and analytics more broadly. So if we go to the next panel, please. And the way we did that is using some global benchmark data from retailers, which is actually very good data. And we estimated a total opportunity of $900 million EBIT annually. And that compares to 2.9 billion of net income for the group, which is very significant. Obviously, you're not going to get the entire potential, but it was large enough to worry about. And broadly, the opportunity was to unlock the data that each of the siloed business units collect and store and manage for the good of the group. Consolidating the data, enriching the data with external data, and then using it for each of the business units to improve their business. There were a number of really basic pilot use cases that confirmed the potential. Some really kind of boring stuff, such as sharing procurement, even reams of paper, those kind of things. But you could imagine how there's more interesting use cases within reach. So once you collect purchasing behavior across the different business units, for example, you can do a lot more in terms of proactive marketing, driving share of wallet, and so on. So what were the actions that were taken? And I'm kind of condensing this here and make it a bit simpler. If we go to the next panel, please. So where do you start in that sort of group? It started with the CEO actually announcing internally and externally, quite publicly, the ambition, and made the point that this is important to the group. From there on, the company established a center of excellence. It's kind of a overused term, but effectively that's what it was. At the center, we had a leader in the group who was charged with getting the opportunity started. There were a number of data scientists at the center, and then we worked with them establishing the technology platform in addition to what they were already having in the various group business units. So we effectively picked a relatively standard cloud-based platform, AWS, which includes a lot of tooling out of the box. So there's not a lot of coding to be done, right? But even more important, as we did that, we also designed the business rules for the data exchange and the governance, effectively giving the business units a reason to participate and say, listen, we're all better off. If you share this kind of data, you're going to get this other kind of information inside our data back, and that'll help you improve your business. That is actually quite difficult to do and took a lot of designing and stakeholder engagement and so on, because the technology and the analytics is relatively straightforward. So they're still at the beginning of the journey, probably about 12 months in, but the learnings, I think, are quite universal. We're talking to many other clients. Where do we start and how do we take this forward? So if we summarize the learnings from this particular experience, there's a few here on the panel. Just because there's a lot of value on the table doesn't mean people will go after it. They still see it as foreign or different or hard to get or risky. It's not sufficient. It's important, but not enough. The technology is typically very easy. You don't need to write any code. It's all off the shelf. Data scientists are expensive, but are available. That's not the hard bit. People, when I say people, I mean, managers and leaders and so on tend to be the difficult bit. What are their incentives? How do we make them participate? How do we make them see potential? And how do we make them make this a priority for their business unit? Another thing we've seen a lot is a lot of companies start quite small and do those pilots, but never really get from the pilot space into an at-scale situation. And you need to scale this up. A handful of use cases is interesting, but frankly, to make meaningful impact, you need to look at 50, even hundreds of use cases. At NAB, and that was a long time ago, we were running 120 algorithms every day. And that was leading at the time. Right now, you would be running thousands, not 5,000. So you need to start small, but as confidence grows, design the whole capability, not the technology only, but also the people to scale up to get towards that value potential. And finally, oversized executive support, like with many change initiatives, is super important because people will get fatigued, they will lose the faith. You need visible and oversized executive leadership, which is what this client had, luckily. So that's just some sort of starting points to get us going on the topic. I'm not sure whether we're doing Q&A now or at the end. Either way, so happy to answer anything, obviously, that is on your mind.
Thank you, Gerd. That was very, very interesting. It's always good to hear a real life example. We do have some questions coming in. So one was just in terms of sustaining the capability. You obviously developed a capability there with the client. Was there anything you had to put in place to sustain that capability going forward?
Yeah, look, this sort of stuff, it's a situation of grow or die. So stagnation is the death. And we have other organizations we talk to where they're sort of a year in and they haven't been able to scale up and they're kind of now struggling to get further funding and so on. You need to grow, otherwise you die. And I think the governance model is probably most important. So the Center of Excellence initially reported to the CEO to make a point, and then was moved into a sort of management board, which includes the CEO and a couple of really senior executives, including the group CFO. It's a pretty big time commitment, and having that governance in place, which gives the small Center of Excellence a direct line to decision makers and funding and so on, is super important because, I mean, obviously they need to perform, but they also need to get the support, the debottlenecking, and further funding. So that governance is probably the most important one. And after sort of year 3 onwards, the capability needs to stand on its own feet. But it does take quite a few years, I think, to reach that sustainable scale.
And Gerd, just on that, obviously this client's a very large client, as you mentioned, but how long does it usually take to establish this sort of Centre of Excellence?
Just to get out the gate, 3 to 6 months. I mean, the technology is cloud-based, so the technology is effectively instant. The hiring of the people is probably the longest lead time. You do need data scientists. They are in hot demand, but you also need a leader who can build a bridge from, you know, the data scientists to the commercial stakeholders. That's quite a big bridge to build. So at NAB, I was doing that, and we had 15 PhDs, and they had never seen a banker in real life. So you need to translate that and build a bridge between the commercial users, and they have a business to run, and they're not interested in your algorithms, but you need to explain to the data scientists what the business problem is and so on. That's not a trivial exercise. We ended up at NAB, we hired a team of 3, and all they did is relationship manage the bankers around the country. So they were traveling all day, and they'd come back into the office and talk to the data scientists, and they would almost translate the different languages. And that was super important in building up new use cases, but also killing use cases that just don't work in the front line or on the ground. So yeah, I think that's super important. But to get it going, 3 to 6 months.
Got it. And one last question, Gerd, and we'll move on. But do you usually find the talent for setting up your Centre of Excellence in-house when you develop your own people, or do you need to go to market?
Typically, you need to go to market. Sometimes there are sort of lone analysts or lone data scientists sprinkled around. So if you had, for example, 5 business units and each one of them has like a data scientist, the lone data scientist doesn't seem to work. So in that case, I would consolidate those guys into the center. You can still assign them to a business unit or to a business so they understand the business quite well, but they need peers, they need a team leader, they need professional development. So you kind of need about 5 or so to have a community at the center. And if you don't have them floating around the company where you could centralize them, you typically have to go to the market. The leader of the unit is probably the harder one to fill because, as I said, they need to be commercial as well as speak the data science language. So that's a difficult talent to find. They are expensive, but you get what you pay for.
Mm-hmm. Yep, they're in demand. Yep. Terrific. Thank you, Gerd. Let's now move to our next speaker, Phil Ridley. Phil.
Hi, everyone. All right, so I'll talk a little bit about getting value from the cloud side of analytics for mining. So if we just go to the next slide, there's a lot of things that are involved in getting value out of it. So what we often see is there's a bewildering range of options out there for deploying cloud. You know, there's new sensors out there and there's new software opportunities, obviously, in modeling, maintenance, operations, automation, finance, and so on, supply chain. So the ultimate question is really what's the best way to derive an architecture for driving data in a mining environment. So we do it from a value-based approach. It's critical to have a wider view. If you just start with technology, what we tend to find is that tech takes over and it tends to drift away from the business value. So what we do is we mine it back or bring it back to the actual basic benefits inside the business and how to articulate those. So you can see here, this is an example of how we can approach it in a driver tree. And this is not comprehensive. This is just some examples of how we can do that. Looking at the top one is obviously the benefits, and looking at part two is the cost. And so how can we ideally get the maximum value out of a type of cloud? And indeed, how can we end up with the right kind of architecture that's going to suit the particular needs that we have? So this is an example here, as I talked at the top. If you look at part one and moving across, there are examples of some of the things that drive some of these decisions and some of these outputs such that we can work out what the architecture would be. Management and speed drive into cost. But moving down towards the cost area, there's a range of areas that we can look at that help us articulate exactly what would be the best match for getting the value out at the minimum risk. And some of these things that you see on the right describe some of the lenses that we use to analyze things. For example, if you look at architecture design, we have to work out where the computing should be compared where the data is and what sort of traffic needs to be managed around the networks. And moving through all the way down to the actual type of infrastructure that we use. And this is very, very important, as I said earlier, because what we want to do is extract value as quickly as possible with as least risk as possible. And that's driven from business, not from technology. It's very easy to deploy large technology out there, but without driving KPIs and metrics and having a big view, we find it tends to drift away from the main part. So this is really how we cover that. I'll just move to the next. Is there any, so I'll let you have a read of this for the moment, but I'll just move on to the next slide if I can, please. All right, so the second question when it comes to cloud technology and analytics is what kind of cloud? And cloud is very complicated. So it's not just, the idea might be to move everything to the cloud, but there are many options there, and cloud is not cloud. There are different kinds of cloud, obviously, depending on what your strategy is and what your architecture and what your skills are. And so often we find that some applications only work in the cloud. There's other applications involved in mining that will not work in the cloud because they don't support networking or they have a physical interface. And so you end up with a bit of a hybrid architecture. And so we've sort of categorized them here into different views. And what I find is helpful in these areas is to focus on a central area and then sort of drift out to the edges as you need to work out what the ultimate architecture is that's best for you. And of course, we can range from having physical tin on site to your own self-managed cloud. And this is quite commonly used in a lot of mines that we see, where we have cloud actually deployed on the site in a data center, somewhere a small data center. And of course, these days, there's managed cloud that comes from some of the large vendors. Google, Microsoft, and Amazon also have devices you can deploy in mines that actually bring the cloud to you, but it has the benefit of having a local footprint, which gets away from a lot of the traffic issues. And then moving to off-premises, of course, if you want to move cloud to off-premises, you have the option of moving to infrastructure, which is merely moving your applications to the cloud, which includes operating system and the rest, or you can consume things as a software service or as a platform service. So it comes down to A, how the applications map and how they actually need to have their environment working, and B, what the philosophy is for the organization. Do you want to manage some of the lower levels? For example, when you move to a software as a service, you don't need to worry about operating systems or platforms. Whereas in some areas, you actually do need to worry about those things because it's very dependent on latency and throughput and so on. And so we find that by articulating, again, the business requirements, then articulating the different cloud options that you have, it ends up with the ideal architecture for what you need to do for analytics. And the analytics platforms, of course, can run in all of these different environments. So that's really my part here on the analytics side. I haven't talked too much about analytics software because, as I mentioned, all of those things sit on top of the architecture once the architecture is right. Architecture is crucial to getting the rest of it right. If the architecture is wrong, other things will not work because the foundations are not correct. Is there any questions on that?
Thanks for that, Phil. It's definitely a hot topic at the moment, and we're definitely seeing a lot of resource companies wanting to move to the cloud. One question is around, what kind of traps are you seeing companies fall into that want to move to the, quite a few want to move to the cloud. What are the traps they're falling into?
That's an interesting one. There's a couple of traps that we see. One of the traps often is not looking at the application landscape first. So when we're talking about analytics and cloud, there's a range of applications, of course, that have different characteristics. And so one size does not fit all. So moving everything to the cloud, for example, may not work because some applications simply don't work well there, or they may actually work there, but they're not supported by the vendor. So that's very, very important. And the other trap is that, as I say, letting technology lead. So there's a bewildering range of very powerful analytics platforms out there, but they tend to drift away from the business case if you don't link it back to the original reason as to why you're doing it, what the architecture can be. So one of the examples often that drives this is latency. So when you have data and you have computing, often the computer is not where the data is. And so transporting large amounts of data to a mine that might be remote can be very expensive and very difficult. So it's often a different architecture is required. So you bring the computer to the data instead. Yep. So real-time connectivity is not always needed, by the way, for all applications. So just on the corollary, you don't need huge, wide, expensive links to all sites because it can often be more cost-effective to have the compute there instead. Yeah.
Great. You answered the second question there, Phil, without even me having to ask it. Thank you. Yeah. And then I guess the other challenge we hear from clients is just around they set a strategy to move to the cloud, and then it turns out to be, very expensive. Any thoughts or advice when they, realize it's actually a lot more expensive and they've set their strategy?
It's an interesting point. Cloud is often more expensive. One of the arguments you hear with cloud is that it's better, faster, and cheaper. Unless you design it for that, it really is. So cost can be two parts. One is the project side, where you're working out the scope of what you're trying to deliver. So that is best managed by getting opportunities ranked and by dependencies to do things in small steps firstly to get the most value as fast as possible, or dollar hanging fruit. The second part is the operational costs of cloud are often higher than people understand or realize, and there are high operational costs involved. And so the way to minimize that is usually to either sweat old assets that don't need to move across, or to retire applications, or hopefully the best option is actually to automate everything so that when you do deploy to the cloud, it actually involves less people and it's faster. So there's a range of things that can happen in those sides. Also right sizing as well. So when you design a cloud architecture, don't build a ginormous architecture. Start small and make it scalable, and that reduces costs from the start.
Sounds good.
Probably
Thank you, Phil.
Time, I suspect.
Yeah, we're almost there. So I thought we'd move on to the next topic. So over to you, Ryan, in North America.
Always the joys and the risk when we have something on technology and the technology doesn't work.
Yeah.
All right. Check. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
All right.
Clear.
So something between the mic and the computer. Excellent. Okay. So basically, as I was saying, so many of you have, no doubt learned how difficult it is to implement significant change and create value, on any type of initiative. But over the recent years, we've just discovered it's way more difficult when you're coming into technology projects, for a number of different reasons, be it the added layer of complexity, the various stakeholders, and certainly I've got many scars on my back going from this learning journey with a lot of clients. So what we want to share with you guys today is just some lessons learned of what are some key criteria for success to help you navigate that really, really bumpy road to get from a technology concept to actual value in the bank. So 4 key criteria I want to talk about today. The first one is maintaining that value-centric mindset. So being value first, not technology first. This is critical to avoid that old shiny object syndrome where you're always jumping from sexy new technology to sexy new technology and never actually seeing value for your investments. Number 2 is around the difficult challenges of maintaining the alignment and ownership of the various many stakeholders involved, from your end users at a mine site who may not be very technically literate at all, to your IT team helping roll out the systems to your vendors, to your, bringing your senior leaders along on the journey. Number 3 is just making sure that you're really, project managing with excellence, as here is, it's so critical to get from, start getting those early wins fast and make that rapid transition, as Gerd was flagging, from pilot to full scale and value in the bank. So how do you do that? And time is so critical there. And then lastly, when you're implementing the technology, it's not just, hey, the technology is implemented. You actually need to change the business, change the routines and the capabilities of the people within the business. Otherwise, it's you're not going to get that long-term success, and it's going to be something that we tried rather than something that we tried and succeeded at. So first, I'll talk about maintaining that value-centric focus. So as I mentioned, it's all about avoiding this shiny object syndrome. And too many times, we go to clients and we hear the common problem of them out with a hammer looking for the nail. They're hearing things like, we're looking for places to apply AI in our operations. We try to, when we're helping clients capture value from technology, we want to always start from the other end. It's first, fully understanding the priority value levers in the business. So you want to go from, we need to find a place to apply AI to, our bottleneck is trucking. Our key issue is we're getting lots of queuing time because the trucks are bunching on the cycle. So we've selected our priority opportunity as, leveraging the full capabilities of an intelligent fleet management system, so that we're, real-time balancing out our cycles and avoiding this queuing and managing when people are getting fuel and stuff like that. So it's really, needing to, maintain that value focus of, identifying down to the input lever of what are the key priority input levers to change. The second point flagging here is just having real meaty business cases and project plans for how you're going to go out and capture it. You often see the business case, example, we're implementing field tools for maintenance, and business cases all around, we're going to get we're assuming an availability improvement, but you really have to make sure that those business cases are going down to that next level of detail. How are, not just the what, where's the value coming from, but how are you actually going to deliver it? What are the specific inputs that we're expecting to change? Basically doing the pre-thinking, the front-end loading to make sure you can get the results. And I think the second thing to emphasize under that, attached to that, having a good meaty business case is a good meaty structured process to manage prioritization. If you're not doing that, you're going to quickly find yourself, significantly overloaded with, too many projects on the go, and also the tendency to jump to the newest sexy thing when it comes out, jumping to the next project before you finish the last one. We, recently worked with a client that had, getting this kind of prioritization really helps on the ROI improvement. The client had about 400 projects on the go, and we helped them really nail down the business cases and nail down the prioritization process, got them down to 56 priority projects, and it actually increased the ROI on that portfolio by 220%. So it's that, while doing that, substantially increasing the probability of any of those projects getting executed in full. And then the last bullet, very strongly tied to the second one. If you don't do, if you haven't really fully defined, where's the value expected to come from? We often see, mission accomplished signs going up as soon as the technology is installed. So, the key discipline to get in place, by defining those, where's the benefits coming from? What are those input targets up front? Then you making sure that your management process around these projects makes sure that you're essentially not walking away until those full values have been realized and demonstrated. So that's critical things about having that value-centric mindset. Jumping on to the next part of our topic number 2 is, as I flagged before, the maintaining the ownership and alignment with so many different stakeholder groups is, you need a real conscious and invested effort is required. First point here is particularly at your end users. When you're implementing stuff at the front line, as I flagged before, most of these folks aren't necessarily as technology savvy as you might have if you're implementing digital solutions at a bank, for example. Had a recent example where they were implementing some real-time maintenance control tools. Imagine a dispatch system for your maintenance personnel out in the field, managing your materials and tools, etc. And the IT or the IT group in a bubble basically designed what the system's going to look like, how's it going to work, what tools are folks going to have in their hands, and they basically designed it all the way through to MVP and ready to start using it in the field before ever actually really engaging with the actual maintenance folks on the front line. So it's, you really need to engage the people at the front line and, understand the user stories from them, understand the, ultimately what they're trying to achieve, what are their problems, and how's the solution going to solve it. It really helps you simplify and make sure you're building a solution that solves their needs rather than does a whole bunch of fancy bells and whistles, but misses the, dilutes the key value proposition there. And then, on the second one there on the, building alignment at the senior levels, this is one that Gerd mentioned, is that, visible, oversized executive, leadership investment. And, obviously setting that expectation up front that it's going to require time, effort. We need to get the leaders out there, visibly, seeing the things that are happening, talking about it, reinforcing it. If you don't have that, first, you're going to, implementation becomes a lot more difficult. And number two, it's a good indicator that you're probably failed on the first thing that I highlighted, that value-centric view. If the senior leaders in the business aren't willing to invest the time to go out there and actually talk about these initiatives, then they're probably, the initiatives aren't actually focused on the primary problems at hand. So it's also a good sanity check from that one. And then the last example is the clear accountability here. Making sure that you're getting that ownership, clear single point person. And it's important that that's a role that's in the line, that has what I mean by in the line is someone who has actual authority and ownership over the location where you're trying to implement the tool and drive the change. One of the last projects we were on when we arrived there was a technology office that was on the side implementing a suite of technology processes, or projects rather, reporting up to a head of innovation. But they were trying to implement these programs on a bunch of various mine sites, and there was zero accountability or expectations among the GMs and the leaders down the business at these actual mine sites. So, once a week, the teams would have their reviews, and once a month they would have their overall, progress reviews, and it'd be, these folks that didn't actually have the ability to drive change on the site were getting sweated, whereas the GMs and people who actually had the authority to make these changes happen, often didn't even know the details of the projects, and so you're doomed to fail if you're not getting that. So that's number two around the alignment and ownership. The third point I want to highlight is just that that excellence in project execution to drive things through fast, that making the fast trip from MVP to VP. The first one around agility, I think Keith flagged that at the kickoff, how much being agile is being adopted in the mentality of businesses, but particularly when you're rolling out these technology programs, if you're not, if you go in and you're planning to such a minute level of detail, you're probably wasting a heck of a lot of time. Often there's a lot of discovery processes going on, developing that MVP, rolling it out, iterating fast. Usually if I go to a client and they whip out their big Primavera plan with hundreds of steps in it, I start getting very nervous. So it's the key thing here is defining really good rollout logic, good milestones, getting a cross-discipline team, and having just a really strong, short interval sprint management to get that urgent pace. Second key element in execution is just making sure there's transparency on both the progress and the results, and then any deviations, become highly visible. The key things there is that you're doing this at the project level as well as at the overall portfolio level. Leverage. The reporting should be automated, so you're spending time implementing rather than doing admin. And then the last bullet here is just emphasizing the criticality of time to results. As I mentioned, Gerd flagged around the challenge of going from a pilot to full scale. Well, what we've found when you're when you're trying to get people to adopt new tools or things that are uncomfortable and unfamiliar, everyone's giving you a certain amount of runway. That, you know, they'll comply with pressure that's being applied by the organization for a certain period of time. But if you don't start demonstrating results relatively quick, if they're not seeing benefits, they're not making that comprehension leap from I've changed this behavior and it's resulted in these benefits. And if you can't demonstrate that in a reasonable period of time, so look for those quick wins, because if you don't, then those people start running out of your runway with folks, and they get off the bus. You know, a good example was recently we were rolling out a dispatch assist tool that helped the dispatchers, you know, basically instantly identify what are the next cycles or next loading units I should be sending these trucks to if I have a breakdown at a shovel, for example. And you get the old dispatchers saying, like, I can beat this system, this algorithm is not useful for me, and you got to, you know, you convince them to try it, give us feedback so we can make it better for the people that don't have that same amount of experience. And the key was they're showing those rapid results, and then actually putting it in front of them, like, you know, get that realization of, hey, you know, me using this tool actually did show some demonstrated benefits, not just on the newbies, but it actually helped me make the decisions faster as well. And so once you reinforce the change actually resulted in improved performance, that's how you really make that leap from, you know, forced compliance to actually understanding and being committed to the new way of doing things. And then, you know, very last, number 4 here to flag is two things that, you know, are absolutely vital if you're going to make the change sustainable. So anything else you may have done everything right up until this point, but if you don't address these 2 points, then, you know, it's only a temporary change. You know, and the first one, you know, embedding the new technology in the DNA or the wiring of the business. So, you know, a lot of the time folks thinking about, okay, we're implementing a new technology, you know, the technology has now been rolled out, excellent. And it's kind of got that old, if you build it, they will come mentality of the people are going to see the tool so sexy and they'll just find ways to build it into their business processes. You know, where in reality, when you're doing this change, you need to really bake it in. You know, what are link it into the data systems, embedded in, you know, example, we had this reporting tool, a real live reporting tool that gave instant feedback on biggest sources of variance. And, you know, you're connecting it to the data systems, you're embedding it in the monthly closing process. You're making sure you're having really good meetings where they're using the tool to hone in on the things that matter. And then you're making clear that there's individuals whose their roles are changing to actually manage and update these tools. So you need to be, you know, if you're not thinking about all these things when you're doing the rolling out, you know, you're not basically, you're wanting to make it as difficult to, if you wanted to go back to the way that you used to do things, a whole other project's going to be required to basically go back to the way things were. That's the kind of, you know, that's what good looks like in terms of embedding it in the fabric of the business. And then, you know, naturally, as you're asking people to change their roles and what they're doing, you got to make sure you're equipping them with the capabilities to go along with it. So, you know, avoid that old, you know, ERP rollout approach of, you know, we're going to install it, we're going to run a bunch of full day training sessions for a week and tick done. You know, generally, when you get to, you know, if you're rolling things out frontline in a mine, you know, classroom training is usually the least impactful way to embed new skills and capabilities. So, you know, example of rolling out when we recently rolled out a shore info control tool, it was you could do the formal classroom training, but then you're out on the job coaching people in the field. Then once they've been coached in the field, you're stepping back, letting them use the tool. You're watching it. You know, once they've got an appropriate handle on it, you're watching them train their step-up supervisors or their you know, their lead hands. So you're getting that kind of see one, do one, coach, teach one kind of combination to make sure you're, you know, really transferring those skills. And then you're making sure that there's a process in place within HR when someone new gets promoted or someone new gets hired, that they get the similar level of, you know, sophisticated capability building. You know, doing these things, you know, if you're not embedding in the system and leaving behind the capabilities to use the new technology, it just becomes, you know, it just doesn't stick. So those were, you know, the key points in a nutshell. I noticed a couple of questions came in while we were doing this exercise. Any questions, Huggo, that we want to cover here?
Yeah, no, that was useful, Ryan. Thanks for that. Some good examples there.
Yeah, a lot of fast talking to get through a lot of material in a short time.
One question was, and we do see it sometimes with our clients where they've invested a lot in technology and it's all good intentions and they've gone hard, but haven't delivered the value from the technology investment that they've made. What kind of approach would you suggest for a client like that just isn't getting payback on their technology investment? Do they start again?
It's a very good question. You know, when do we call it done and, you know, jump to another horse? So first I would, you know, take the step back to, you know, looking at the, you know, the mention I made around the business case or the original plan. If they haven't had that level of detail, I'd be having the, you know, you want to have the conversation of what was the actual behavior change or the operating change that you were expecting that was going to drive this value. So making sure that we're not just kind of looking at the scoreboard, but looking at, you know, what are the players doing in the field. So if you're in a world where, you know, everyone's using the technology and they're doing the things that they're supposed to be doing and the process is functioning the way it's supposed to be functioning and, you know, everything is working, we're just not seeing the value at the, you know, coming out the end of the pipe. You know, usually you'll do a bit of study and making sure there's not some other counter physical that, you know, you're playing a bit of whack-a-mole, that you've unlocked extra production time because you're managing startup shift tighter, but then people are just taking a longer break, right? So you want to make sure you problem solve and make sure you're not getting that whack-a-mole problem. But then, you know, often you need to be realistic when you get to that stage. If you're in a world where we just overestimated the value that was going to come from this project, you know, we were over optimistic at the front end. You know, a lot of the time it's better just to say, okay, it was only worth half the value we thought it would be. Everyone's like, it's working the way it's supposed to, and you just, you know, write down the value rather than fall into the trap of adding scope creep of, oh, what if we add this extra functionality to the tool? What if we add this extra piece of technology on top? And you end up basically, you know, sneaking in a bunch of additional projects through the back door that really haven't been approved or thought through fully. So that'd be my advice in that situation.
Yeah, good, useful. Yep. And a second question, you talked about getting ownership from the operational side, from the mining site. I know I was actually with a COO of a mining business last week who was lamenting and being frustrated by the fact that technology had been built and the site wasn't owning it. What kind of tips do you have for someone in that position? How best to get the site to own the technology plan, I guess?
Yeah. So I think that, you know, the problem they described to you is one of the, you know, almost the same as the example I gave, where, you know, the technology had been built and it's, you know, ready to go and now they're not owning it. Well, you know, if you haven't involved them in you know, making the sausage, then they're less likely to want to eat it, right? So I think that, you know, ideally in an ideal world, you're involving folks up front so that they feel like their voice has been heard, and then also that the solutions are as practical as possible to address the problems. But if you get to the stage where, you know, you're in this position where you've got the technology nearly fully designed and, you know, you're ready to go, you know, the thing that I found, if you're not getting that ownership, is simply around, you know, messaging and positioning and good old-fashioned change management. If you're working with the people at the front line and say, you know, instead of, hey, we're changing your role completely because we thought of this technology that's a better way to do it, but rather come and say, you know, will you pilot this with us? Give us some feedback, help us refine it. And, you know, oftentimes they'll sign up to pilot it for a period of time, and, you know, the feedback may come back, actually it works very well, there's no change, let's go with it. Or they may have a few, you know, minor tweaks. So that would be the way that I would do it, is kind of bring them on the bus of helping us trial it, you know, make it better, and play like that.
Got it. Useful. Yep. And one last question, Ryan. Just the other area you mentioned was how important it was to have project management excellence in driving these technology initiatives. In the COVID world of remote working, how was that played out?
Yeah, so it does make it, you know, much more, you know, it makes it more difficult initially to get there. I think it's, you know, there's enough technology out there that, you know, ideally the team that's trying to roll out technology should be one that can adopt it fairly quickly. But I think that some of the key things that I've seen from, using remote teams trying to roll out technology projects and, any project really, as I've found that there's a couple things when you go to the remote delivery is, some of the key stuff is just making sure that you're tightening up your review cycle. So whereas previously you might have had a single meeting in the morning to line everybody up and agree the priorities and send people out on their way chasing it. This would be, generally from, if I'm remote delivery, I'm making sure that the team that's managing the improvements are doing a morning lineup, and then either checking in midday and checking in end of day. So you're just kind of updating those touch points, which not only helps from maintain the urgency when people are working in their basements in their pajamas, but also kind of helps with the psychology of it as you feel like you're getting together and problem solving as a team. So that'd be some things I would recommend.
Terrific. Thanks, Ryan. That's been very helpful and useful. There's a few more questions coming in, and I'm just looking at the time. We've got 5 minutes to go, and I guess one question is probably back to Phil Ridley, and it was just about cyber risks and around the risk of cyber when one's developing the cloud strategy and the architecture, whether there's enough focus on, the risk of cyber, which is definitely becoming more prominent these days.
Yeah, it's a very moot point actually. I see two spheres for cyber. One is in the architecture. So one is where you minimize the vectors into the infrastructure that you have. So in other words, you control all the access points as best you can. And I say as best you can because access points are an opening to anyone, good or bad. Secondly, a lot of the applications that we see in mines, even though they work well, may not necessarily be hardened for cyber. So the second part of that is staying very relevant with the manufacturers of the software that you use to minimize any issues that they have as well. So for example, some of the protocols are open and some of the old, they don't use encryption. So there's a few things that need to be balanced. But again, that's part of the architecture. When you design the solution, it's very, very important that that becomes one of the architectural lenses that you use. There's no perfect system. And the second part to the overall thing is assume that you are working in a hostile environment and have an action plan ready to go when you do have any issues. There's really no secret answer except to embed security from the very start to the very end.
Terrific. Thanks, Phil. Now, Steve was making some good comments to me. Steve Riddell, hello. I don't know if you wanted to make a quick comment there to our panel, but you were just talking about data and some of the challenges you've got. I thought it'd be interesting to share.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for promoting me to a panelist.
You're welcome.
Yeah, what I shared with Michael was really, I guess, a journey we're sort of on with our organisation, where we have a lake of data that's kind of more than we can even comprehend ourselves. So we're organising our data, changing our business processes so that we can generate clean data that's insightful, and organising ourselves in the cloud. So we're well and truly on the way, but I think sort of the barrier that we're stuck with at the moment, or working our way through, is, when you have a bunch of executive managers that kind of have a ton of experience and insight and intuition, and then a bunch of propeller heads who kind of know and understand data, there is a conflict. There's kind of data telling us one thing and guiding in one direction, but then kind of management with this expertise and potentially a bias sort of wanting to go the other way. So I guess the journey we're on is how do you kind of blend data driven decisions with management skill, expertise, insight, and try and suppress some of the bias that management has, right? Because they've always done it a particular way. How do you let data kind of show them a new way, but still rely on their skill and expertise in that decision making? So it's kind of like it's more of a fascinating psychological journey rather than a technology journey, but it's But it's how do you blend the two? How do you blend that kind of management skill and technology together so you have some great decision making going on? And, you know, I can think of examples where the data is just saying one thing and management is saying, yeah, but that's not right. You know, but it is right. It's what the data is saying. So it's probably not really a question, just more of an insight into sort of where we're at with our journey. We're at that level of change management now with decision making using data, and some of the consequences of that, and some of the change impacts we probably underestimated.
Yep. No, good point, Steve. Absolutely. These businesses are all very much the same business with the same levers, and, you know, executives have great intuition and experience about how to manage those levers. The challenge is we've got new tools and data and ways of representing it. How do we, you know, best bring that into how we manage? Yeah. It's a good challenge. Thank you. Very good. I'm very conscious of time. Oh, go, Phil.
Sorry, Phil. Very quick one. Yeah, so one of the issues, and Steve sort of raised it, is getting credibility with data. So producing analytical reports and so on is very, very important, but it's equally important to get credibility and truth and justice in what you're seeing. So when the data is put forward, people need to understand it and make sure that it's validated and works so that people start building up confidence in it. Because when you move to a new area, beyond what is intuitive, you need to have that basis. And if people don't believe the data they're seeing, then you can have a bit of a waste of time scenario happening. Yep.
Thanks, Phil. Yes, I'm very conscious it's 1 minute to 11, so I wanted to make sure that we're on time, but wanted to thank our panelists, but more importantly, clients and others from industry that joined us. We're obviously very passionate about the resource and mining sector and are very excited about the journey that we're currently going on with quite a few clients. And we've built a sizable technology and analytics team and digital team at Partners in Performance. So if you're ever wanting to just share ideas or talk things through, then we're always happy to get on the phone and have a conversation. But for today, we're just happy to be able to share some of the work and insights that we've had and thank you very much for your time.